I think that the first time I had an opportunity to hear Steve Reich's drumming was probably when Nexus played at PASIC in the early 2000s. To be honest, I wasn't real familiar with the piece at the time, and I wasn't entirely sure what was happening, but I thought it was remarkable. As I listened to the performance and then later on learned a bit more about the piece, I realized it was a really fascinating and different way of writing for percussion than I was familiar with, even though the piece has obviously been around for many decades and had at that point as well. So fast forward many years later, I'm sitting at my desk at McMaster and I check my email and I get a message from none other than Russ Hartenberger. And he wanted to meet with me to talk about some of the work that I'm doing. You see, in addition to directing the percussion ensemble at McMaster, I run the Maple Lab, where we research a variety of music psychology issues, oftentimes with a bit of a percussion focus. So you might be familiar with some of the studies we've done showing, for example, how internationally acclaimed marimbist Michael Burritt, when he tries to produce notes that are long and short on the marimba using long and short striking gestures, actually fails to change the acoustic duration of the note, but actually makes a note that sounds longer or shorter in the mind of the listener. So Russ had heard about this work and some of the other things that we were doing and was interested in chatting more. From that conversation, I ended up writing a chapter in his book, Cambridge Companion to Percussion, which offers a number of ideas on how research from cognitive sciences can actually help our performing and teaching and conducting as percussionists. And out of those conversations, I learned he was writing another book on the music of Steve Reich, and he had a burning question that he thought might be interesting to explore. He wanted to know what actually happened when they're executing the phasing of having those two percussionists gradually pull apart. Now, I thought that was a really cool and interesting idea because, well, one, I'd wondered many times myself what exactly is happening there. And two, it's an issue where music psychology is positioned very well to give us an interesting exploration into a issue in a piece of music that's very important to us musically. So one of the questions I know Russ had at the time was that he felt like on occasion he was actually slowing down, even though he's playing the part that is actually pulling away from the steady part. And that seems entirely at odds with the entire goal of the piece and his experience of attempting to make it to pull apart from the other part there. So he had that question and a number of others, and we came up with the idea for a really fascinating study to try and get at the heart of what actually happens when doing the phasing in Steve Reich's drumming. Part of what I found so interesting about this project is it's been an amazing opportunity for me to learn more about the history of this piece and how it was developed and how it's come to play such an important role in our repertoire. So now I'm going to turn over to Russ Hartenberger, who's going to give you some background on his experiences with Reich's music and the development of the piece strumming, because he was there at the premiere, and give you the background for the research study that we did. And then I'll walk you through an overview of what we found. I look forward to then having a discussion about this later on in our subsequent meeting. And I think it'll be a really interesting time to learn about this really important piece that many of us have performed and probably all of us have heard, but have rarely had a chance to actually understand what exactly is happening when you peek really closely at what's going on.
In 1971, I was a graduate student at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, in their world music program, and I became very interested in the music of West Africa, and particularly the country of Ghana. I decided I wanted to go to Ghana in the summer to find out more about the music and hear it in its home environment, but I didn't know how to go about it. I happened to mention this to a fellow graduate student, Richard Teitelbaum, and Richard was a composer from New York City, and he said he had a friend of his, a fellow composer named Steve Reich, who had been to Ghana the summer before, and now that he was back in New York City, he was composing a piece for percussion, but he didn't know any percussionists. So Richard suggested that Steve and I get together in New York, and Steve could tell me about his experiences in Ghana and also about the piece he was composing. So I got together with Steve Reich, and he told me about Ghana and invited me to a rehearsal of his piece that he titled Drumming. So I came to rehearsal and I was intrigued by the music, decided to keep going to rehearsals. and became a regular member of the Reich ensemble. Now, the process of learning drumming was a very interesting one. We were taught by rote. So what happened was Steve would write music during the week, but instead of showing us notation, he would demonstrate each part. Now, Steve was a percussionist, so he had facility on percussion instruments, so he was able to play the instruments. He would demonstrate a part, and we would imitate it and repeat it until we memorized it and attached it to what we had learned the week before. This is the way we learned the entire piece, which was about an hour and 20 minutes long. It took us the better part of a year, weekly rehearsals, to learn the piece. Now, one of the techniques, the compositional techniques that Steve Reich used in composing the piece was something he called phasing. Now, this is a process he discovered actually with tape recorders. He was trying to align two tape recorders with tape loops so that they would play at exactly the same time. But because of the mechanical differences in the tape recorders, one sped up and moved a little faster than the other one, got out of synchronization with it. Now, first, he was surprised by this, but then he was interested in the sound combination that it created. So he began experimenting with composing music using this phasing technique, but with people doing it rather than tape recorders. So in drumming, what happens is two people play exactly the same pattern, and one person speeds up, just like was happening on the tape recorders, until reaching a position one beat ahead of the other player, and then would lock in to a new composite rhythmic pattern. Now, this is a counterintuitive process for performers. We're trained to play with people, not to speed up against another person. So it took a little while getting used to, but once I had done it for a while, I found it a really intriguing process and enjoyed doing it. Now, fast forward to, I guess, around 2013, talking to Mike Schutz about it. Mike was in Hamilton and I was in Toronto, so very close together. And Mike invited me to his lab at McMaster and showed me what he'd been working on, some of the experiments he'd been doing with rhythm. And I was very interested. So Mike said, well, you know, it just so happens that there's a music perception and cognition conference at Ryerson University in Toronto the summer of 2013, and suggested that I go to it and just see what various people were experimenting with and researching. So I went to the conference, and one of the presentations was by Justin London, who in collaboration with Rainer Polak had been researching music from Mali. And in this presentation he gave, he played a recording of some traditional music in which there was an accelerando. So the ensemble sped up together. And they analyzed this accelerando. So I found that really interesting. First of all, that there was an accelerando in African music, because it was something I was not familiar with in the West African music that I was studying. And secondly, that they were able to analyze the accelerando. So I happened to mention this to Mike Schutz, and I said, you know, Mike, this is really interesting research that Justin and Rainer are doing. And I wonder if we could do something similar to this with this technique of phasing in drumming. So Mike got very excited about it, and he arranged for Bob Becker, who's a colleague of mine in Nexus, and also the Steve Reich Ensemble, and I to come to the live lab at McMaster University and record the phases in drumming. And then Mike would arrange to have them analyzed and computerized and actually see what was going on, what really was happening in a phase. So we did that, and Mike will explain to you how we did it and what the results were.
Now that you have some of the background of how we got to this project, I want to talk a little bit about how this piece works. So I have here an excerpt of the score for two measures illustrating what happens before and after the completion of one of the phases we analyzed. So as you can see, in measure 9 to 10, we have a shift in the moving voice. So the steady voice stays in the same position, we have the same rhythms, and notice how the moving voice shifts. So that by the time we get to 10, it's actually one beat ahead of that steady voice. We can graph this out on a scale like this, where at the bottom we have the position of the meters in measure 9, and up top we have the position in measure 10. Now, what should happen is that we start in synchrony, and then they might stay together for a bit, at which point the moving voice would start to pull ahead and end one beat ahead of where it started in terms of his relation with that nominally steady voice. It's an interesting sound, and it's unlike most other kinds of rhythmic synchronization tasks where the goal is typically to try and stay together. Now, we were hoping to do a demonstration of this at the conference, and obviously that's not possible, but we did have the opportunity to give a couple of these demonstrations previously. So we were able to play this at the Percussive Art Society International Convention, which was a great opportunity back in 2019. And here's an example of an excerpt when we were practicing getting ready for that. And there you go. Now, in the experiment we did, Russ was able to play with his longtime partner, Bob Becker, who's probably a little bit more comfortable and familiar with this and able to execute it better than I was. And we recorded them in the live lab. We took a slight deviation from the original setup in that we used two sets of bongos so that we could put triggers in each of the drums. This is important so we can get the exact timing information from each part as it phased. And so although that's a little bit different than the way they perform this in regular concerts, everything else was about as similar as we could get it. We had two very familiar performers who had played this piece many times, both together and individually, and they've also are using sticks and a setup of natural bongo drums that are as close to the original as we could get it. This allows us to look at some questions that I think are unique to this particular study. So we can see there's at least two aspects of this that turn out to be in a really interesting way. So the first thing is when we look at Russ's part, which is the moving part, we can see that it does start pulling away from the steady part. But rather than moving steadily the entire time, there's this interesting back and forth pattern. So we can see that rather than just the monotonic increase in the time there, moving a beat ahead, there's this interesting sort of back and forth, which is fascinating because when we started the project, I know one of the questions that Russ had is how he sometimes felt like he was actually slowing down while playing, even though he was always pulling ahead of his partner there. The other thing that's fascinating about this is we can see that the nominally steady voice is actually tracking pretty closely what that moving voice is doing in terms of the patterns of moving back and forth. Now, we published this initial part of the analysis in Russ's book, The Performance Practice and the Music of Steve Reich, in a chapter looking at the anatomy of a phase. And I think it's a really fascinating way to gain insight into an issue of synchronization that we normally explore using a very different route. So we have a lot more information about this project on our website. I encourage you to check that out. If you're interested, you can see an interesting visualization tool. And we also link to a workshop that we were able to do on March the 6th, 2020, just before everything took a change in our world. And there you can hear a lot more background information and see more in-depth analyses. So I just wanted to acknowledge the many people who helped contribute to this project and the funding agencies that helped us support this work. And if you have any questions about this, I'd be happy to chat either more now or later on if you just send us an email. Thanks.